Amen. So, here we go. This is a great parable that will often elicit this feeling that there's something not quite fair going on in this story. Would you like it if you'd been out there working all day in the blazing heat from first thing in the morning till dusk, and somebody else shows up and they just put in an hour or so, and then they get paid the same as you? It just doesn't quite feel right, does it? But then there's the question that the landowner asks, which is, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? And of course, most of us would say, well, yeah, I can do what I want with things that belong to me. So a little tension there, isn't there, between what we feel and what we reason out. So I'd like to look at this parable a little bit and see if we can talk it through. Now, those folks who go to church here regularly know that in the long history of the church has always held, the mainstream church has always held, that there are 4 different ways to read any scripture passage. There is the literal way of reading it, which says that this story is about workers, a vineyard, and money, literally. And then there are the spiritual ways of reading it, of which there are 3. There's the analogical reading, which says this whole story is an analogy to something else, in which case we have a character like the owner of the vineyard. Who might that be? We have the workers. Who might they be? In a sort of analogical sense. And then there's a sense in which Scripture can be read anagogically, which means it tells us something about the way in which the narrative of the Bible unfolds and where it is going, what the world will look like one day. The Bible refers to that as the fullness of time, or the end of time, or something like that. And then there's the moral reading that says somewhere in this passage there is a moral imperative for you, and me, of course, but we're supposed to do something as a result of this. So 4 ways of reading a passage. So I thought we might sort of wiggle our way through those and see where it takes us. So let's start off at the beginning here. The kingdom of heaven is like, well, according to the story, it's a place where if the landowner is supposed to be a representative of God in the story, the landowner, rewards people equally, even if their contributions to that place in the form of their work are not equal, which means that the economy of the kingdom is not based on an hourly rate model, but on a showing up for work model. You show up, you get paid. Doesn't matter how many hours that you work. Now, this morning when I was giving this sermon, I happened to know that in the room we had the shop steward for a union group at a local organization. And I said, what do you think? How would this work out for your folks? He gave me a glum look, like, this model would go absolutely nowhere in our environment at all. Not at all. It just doesn't feel right. But then the landowner says, but it's my money. Can't I do what I want with it? And if what we're looking at here is the idea that the landowner pays people regardless of what they have earned, without regard to their earning potential, without regard to their input and their labor, well, in the church we have a word for that, don't we? Something that comes to you that you have not earned. Grace. That's right. So the landowner chooses to reward the workers based on his own grace, his ability to give, not on the workers' own efforts. And of course, Protestants love that idea, because the idea is that God's grace comes to you and you don't have to do any work to earn it, right? So that should sound very familiar. But when you start really seriously thinking about reading this story analogically, then you have to realize that there are other components in the story that lie in analogy to something else. It's not just that the landowner is a model for God, but what about the vineyard itself? Well, in the Hebrew Bible, the vineyards are almost exclusively used as a symbol to represent the covenant people of God. All of the way through the Old Testament, you can go back and have a look. So like here in Isaiah it says, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is What is the vineyard? The house of Israel. And the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. And similarly in Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah has God speaking, if you like, saying, many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. It belongs to God. It's God's own vineyard here. And they've done something horrible to it and made it desolate in this particular story. So what we see is that the vineyard is the house of Israel, people of Judah, and the vineyard is of the Lord of hosts. It belongs to the Lord. That's the analogy that they use. Jesus, of course, will have known this, and so is using this sort of imagery when he's telling this parable and talking to the people. But notice that both in Isaiah and in Jeremiah and pretty much everywhere else, when the vineyard is described, there's something wrong. So in Isaiah, it says, we expected justice, but we got bloodshed. Righteousness, but we heard people crying out. And in Jeremiah, it says that many shepherds, so leaders of the flock, have destroyed God's vineyard and made it a desolation. So this image of a vineyard almost always has something in it that's not quite right. In the Old Testament, Jesus knew this, and so did the people talking. So in our parable that Jesus told here, notice there are 5 groups of workers that go out early in the morning, 9 o'clock, noon, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Of course, it says absolutely none of this in the New Testament. This is all rendered into English so it makes sense for us. It would typically say like in the 3rd hour, in the 6th hour, in the 9th hour, things like that. So, but all the way through the day, the different groups of people go out. And if you look at that, you'll notice there are those who are sort of there from the beginning. When the sun first comes up, they're there. They came early in the morning. And then these groups go all of the way through to those who come about 5 o'clock, including those who came sometime in between. And when we think about that in terms of the vineyard being composed of people of the covenant, we'll start to think, what does this mean? Who are the people who show up at the end of the day? Here, the ones who stand up, who appear at 5 o'clock. In the parable, it says that they were in the marketplace waiting for someone to hire them, someone to welcome them in and bring them into the vineyard, but nobody would until this particular vineyard owner came along. They're saying, no one has hired us. We've just been left standing. And then this particular vineyard owner, who is our model for God, says, you also go into the vineyard. These are the people that nobody else wanted. They are the ones that no one would hire. They were maybe the elderly, the weak, those who didn't look very strong, like they couldn't do a day's work. Nobody would hire them. They were left there. And then this vineyard owner comes along and says, no, come on in, even though nobody else wants them. So who are all of these people? There are those who have been there since the beginning, the covenant people of God. There are those who arrive sometime between the beginning and the end. Those would be converts and proselytes. And then there are those that nobody wants. They would be the Gentiles and other excluded persons, of which there were many at this time who were excluded from the full practice of Judaism. So this is a model, although it says really nothing about inclusion of different types of people and talks exclusively about money and labor. The analogy that was commonly used would have told everybody that this is what this story is actually about. It's about including the people that nobody wanted, the ones who were still there at the end of the day because nobody would hire them. And this landowner brings them all in. So how does he differentiate between all of these people? Well, he doesn't. He doesn't differentiate between those who were there in the beginning, the original covenant people, and those who are welcomed in at the end, the people that nobody else wants, the marginalized, the excluded. He treats them all exactly the same. So those who were hired at 5 o'clock, they got the usual daily wage, so they got a denarius for their day's work, but so did the ones who got there first. They're all treated identically. Now we saw in these Old Testament images that there's always a problem in the vineyard. And there's a problem in this vineyard too, isn't there? It's the first group of workers, the people who were there first. They look at what's going on and they don't like it, because it offends somehow their sense of justice, that they worked all day long and somebody else just popped in at the end and everybody gets treated the same. And somehow that doesn't smell right to us, does it? It just doesn't. So, what's the source of all of this contention? Well, the landowner puts his finger on it here and says, are you envious because I'm generous? And if what we're really looking at here is the graciousness of this landowner here, what happens is that the graciousness of the landowner is a sort of affront to our sense of justice here. It just doesn't feel right that someone works 10 hours and somebody else works 1 hour. They get paid the same. We say, that's not right. But maybe it's not about right and wrong in that sense. Maybe it's about being gracious here. So I'd like to just talk about that for a moment. What we're really talking about, if we want to see what that's got to do with the world today, is distributive justice. So distributive justice says the landowner has a certain amount of money, and then there's a group of workers, and this is going to get distributed on some basis to the workers. Now, the way we usually do it is we say for every hour that you work, you get a certain amount of money, right? That's how it works for most people. And so that's the system that we use for distribution of wages. We do it like that. Let's pick something other than money, just to make it a little bit more interesting. Let's talk about, say, healthcare. How about that? We have a certain amount of healthcare in the country, and we want to distribute it among the people. How should we do that? Should we distribute more and more and more and more healthcare to people who work more and more and more and more hours? In other words, those who've earned the money to pay for it get it, and those who showed up at the end of the day and only worked for an hour, they don't get much money in most circumstances, so they can't pay for it, so they get none. Should we do that? It's not just healthcare that works that way, of course. You could do it with, education, housing, so on. We have a certain amount, we want to distribute it. And we think of it like a pie. And we slice the pie up, and I look at it and I say, okay, here's my pie, and I've got, 8 slices, but there's more than 8 of you. So what am I going to do? How am I going to distribute this pie that constitutes healthcare among you? If I had a solution for this, of course, right, I'd be in a really strong position in the country today, because this is hard. This is hard stuff. How should we do it? How should we hand out slices of the pie that represent healthcare to people? Should we give it on the basis of the ability to pay? The more you work, the more you earn, the more you can pay for. If you don't work, you don't earn, you can't pay for it, you get nothing. Should we do that? Should we distribute it on the basis of need? So the most needy person gets the healthcare now, and if you're fit as a fiddle and you don't need any, you don't get any, because it's being distributed on the basis of need. How should we distribute it? Should we distribute it so that everybody gets identical piece of pie? I don't really want an identical piece of pie here, because that would mean that when we're handing out OBGYN services, if they're going to go equally to all people, then I get them too, and I don't want them. So that doesn't work, does it? Or maybe if we're thinking about slices of pie here, we're getting ready to hand it out, and maybe Cookie says, yeah, I don't want that. I don't like that pie. I don't want it. I'm going to opt out of having any pie. So what do we do about that? Is that allowed when we're distributing the pie, for you to opt out? There are all sorts of things. So the one model we talked about, the one we're most familiar is you get what you work for. There's a long history in the country, of course, the Protestant work ethic. The more you work, the more you get. The more you work, the bigger your slice of the pie. But there are all sorts of models, including the second one I put down here, that says you get what you can take. The stronger and more powerful you are, the bigger your slice of the pie. And then there are lots of other models as well. There are literally dozens. We don't have time to talk about them all. In this parable, the model here is that everyone gets a slice of pie. Everybody, doesn't matter when they showed up in the vineyard, everybody got their slice of pie at the end of the day. Everyone. Well, how can that possibly work? Well, it's because the pie, representing God's grace, is infinite because it's God. So God can hand out God's grace, slices of pie, and just keep going and going and going and going. And if you get a slice, it doesn't mean that God's going to run out and there won't be a slice for me. Because God's grace can just keep pouring out and pouring out and pouring out and pouring out. I don't have to worry about being left out because it's God. And to be honest with you, I think the last thing that I want from God is what I've earned. I don't know about you, but I can look back in my life and see entire blocks of time, incidents where I think, I really hope God wasn't watching when I did that. Because if I get paid back for that, I'm in real trouble. If I get paid for that, what I earned in that set of actions is going to cause a lot of trouble. I don't really want that. What I want is grace. And that is one aspect of what this story is about. What we want from God is grace. Now, we can't, of course, use this model to distribute healthcare. Because unlike God, we don't have an infinite amount of healthcare. God has an infinite amount of grace. We have a limited amount of healthcare. So we have to figure out what to do about that. Same with education, same with all sorts of things. But the parable says, while you're figuring it out, keep reciting in the back of your mind the word grace, 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 grace. As soon as you take grace out of the mix, then we're in serious trouble. Then we wind up with situations like the strong and powerful get everything, those who earn all of the money get everything, the weak get nothing. All of those sorts of models rise to the top. So if you're involved in any of those sorts of conversations, please just keep saying to yourself in the back of your mind, grace, 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 grace. And try and weave some of it into the models that we come out with. So let's just look at that. Imagine that you are the worker that nobody would hire. You've been standing in the marketplace all day, and all these landowners have come by, and they take that person and that one, and they just leave me standing there, or you. We get nothing, just pass by all of the time. Nobody wants us. And then this one landowner comes along and says, you go into the vineyard too. And when you go in, you realize, wait, it's almost the end of the day. I'm only going to get to work for maybe an hour. I can't earn enough to pay for a slice of the pie. So tonight my family will go hungry and my children will not be fed. But at the end of the day, it turns out that there was enough for everyone. Everyone. Even you. Even me. That's why grace matters. There's enough for everyone in the end. So, that's why this song is so popular. It's the reason that grace is so amazing. It really is. Especially the third line. It saved a wretch like me and a wretch like you. The person who was left standing in the marketplace that nobody wanted. And the landowner comes along and says, come on in. See, you were lost, but then you were found. And hopefully, through thinking about the parables of Jesus, maybe we've been blind, but perhaps we can see. And what we get to see is just how amazing grace is when we allow it to infiltrate our lives. But all of our lives, not just church, politics and education and healthcare, food, all of those sorts of things. The more we let grace infiltrate that, the more it shapes what we see. And maybe we can move from a sort of blindness to a better vision.